Thank you so much, Nikhil. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining us in the world. Welcome to this edition of our initiative that's conducted jointly by IIM Calcutta, the IIM Center for Entrepreneurship, and the E-Cell, which is the student arm of IIM Calcutta, and IIMCIP, which is our incubator. We're very excited to have four distinguished panelists, all of whom are wonderful IIM Calcutta alums, joining us for this discussion. Mr. Ajay Jain is from the he graduated in 1983 with 36 years of experience as an entrepreneur and a business head in the corporate world. He started by setting up a trading and contracting company in Kuwait and then joined the SRF group, followed by a stint in the Raymond Group, where he was the head of JK Helen Curtis and Raymond Fedora. Mr. Jain has developed a track record of building businesses through out of the box strategic planning and execution skills. Since 2011, he has been the promoter and managing director of Enzotech Solutions Private Limited, a company in the water and wastewater recycling business. Enzotech won the CII Award for Water Conservation, has 2 patents for products development, and is being recognized as a leading company in the business space. Thank you for being here with us, Ajay.
Thank you.
Mr. Srikant Sastri is an alum from graduating in 1985, and he is also at present the chairman of the IIMCIP, Innovation Park. He's a successful entrepreneur, having built and sold 2 large service ventures in India and Southeast Asia. He's presently a board member and advisor to several emerging companies, university incubators, Government of India and Bihar state government. He also is the co-founder of Creon Data and chairman of I3G Advisory Network. He's just written a book which is going to be out. How soon now, Shrikant? Is it in the bookstores already?
Not yet. Another 30 days.
Another 30 days. So watch out for it. I've seen an advanced copy. It is fascinating and worth everyone's while to buy.
Thank you.
So, and Srikant is a regular speaker and trainer at corporations, incubators, universities, and startup forum. Thank you for joining us, Srikant.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Mr. Neelotpal Sahai is an alum from the 1994 PGDM batch and a BTech from IIT BHU. At IIM Calcutta, his focus was in finance and IT systems. He's been working in Indian capital markets for over 19 years. First in UTI Securities, SBC Warburg, Vickers Ballas, and 15 years in asset management at IDFC Mutual Fund and HSBC Mutual Fund. In his current role, he is the head of equities at HSBC and Asset Management, where he has been since 2013. His skill sets are portfolio management of equities, fundamental analysis of corporates, valuation of equities, risk management, and he has a very strong working knowledge of the overall macroeconomics of the nation and of the world. His work experience, he also has work experience in the IT industry, having been at Infosys for 7 years. Thank you for joining us, Neil. And last but not least, Venkatesh Krishnamoorthi is also an alum of the 1994 batch. He was a sociology graduate before his PGDM, one of us unusual types, Venki, you and me.
Yep.
But Venki's interest in computers peaked during his stay at IIM, and then he joined Wipro Infotech from the campus in the sales function. After working in California software, Trigent and Photon, Venki launched his own company, Maarga Systems, along with his wife Gayatri, and is specialized in low-code software with clients spanning 20 different countries, making Maarga a micro MNC. Venki has a deep interest in technology and digital marketing. So thank you all for being with us. What we're going to do today is start with a question to Neil to give us a broad background of how you think the economy is going to progress in the next several months. Perhaps talk a little bit about where it's been and what changes do you see in forthcoming that might be useful for all of our panelists and our audience to understand. Thank you, Neil.
Surely. Thank you, ma'am. First of all, thank you for having me on the panel. Thank you to all the fellow panelists as well as to the audience who is there today on a Saturday evening. So this is a question which we have been grappling throughout the year, because this is a year like no other, and there had been momentous changes and changes at a rapid pace. If the same question was asked before the pandemic also, then also the answer wouldn't have been straightforward. But let me try to give a structured answer in about 4 or 5 minutes and look at the economy from the perspective of the government, from the labor market perspective, and I'll spend a little bit more time from the corporate sector. From the government perspective, this was a tough year. Their resources have been constrained largely on account of economy activity slowing down. So the resource mobilization has been weaker, much weaker than expected. At the same time, the non-tax revenue that government was anticipating is also weak. And expenditure has gone up. Government was expected to step in because the private sector capex and the expenditure by the rest of the participants of the economy has been weaker. They have done their bit, their part, and which is why their finances has been strained this year. From the labor market perspective also, it was a tough year. We saw a migration in the country, which is the second largest after the partition period. The unemployment shot up in the period of the lockdown period. Since the opening up, it has begun to come back. Still has not become normal, but inching towards normal. Now I turn my attention to the corporate sector. For the corporate sector also, the experience was not uniform. And when the pandemic hit in the March of this year, and the national lockdown followed after that, again, both the experience of the pandemic as well as the lockdown, we had not seen before. There was no template in front of the corporate sector how to respond to this. And as a result of which, the first reaction of the corporate sector was to go into a shell. And that's what not unexpected. And everyone was actually trying to survive at that period. And the only mantra that the corporate sector was following at that point of time was cash preservation. To give an example, we spoke to one of the companies. We keep on speaking to the companies throughout the year. One of the largest cement companies, which in the past has grown on account of mergers and acquisitions. And because of the stock market price decline, we thought that the potential merger candidate prices have also fallen quite a lot. And this large cement company has got a lot of cash balance. So one of the question was that, is that company looking forward to making some acquisitions because the potential prices has come down? Their answer was an unequivocal no. And that they would wait and watch for most of this fiscal year and would want to use this cash only in the subsequent year. At this point of time, the only thing one is thinking about is to how to preserve the cash, how to see through this crisis. That was, I think, early in the month of April. But soon enough, we realized that the impact of the lockdown is not uniform, and certain sectors did move from, began to revive, and in fact, they began to thrive, specifically in the sectors like pharmaceutical and diagnostic industry, in the FMCG and the packaged food industry, internet data, home delivery of goods and services, among a few of which actually thrived. And they have maintained their growth rate, a trend growth rate, and as well as some of them actually are doing better than the trend growth rate because they have been gaining market share at the cost of the competing lines of product. Pharmaceutical companies also gained during the year on account of the newer drugs for the COVID-19, although not successful, but people were taking those medicines just to be sure, actually, although it defined benefit was not there. So they benefited and have been benefiting. The consumer sector, especially the consumer goods, which suffered in the time of the lockdown, began to revive when the lockdowns slowly began to get lifted. That was in the month of June. And then one thought a lot of that could be on account of pent-up demand. Then there was a brief lull in July, August, when the COVID cases actually went up. But from September onwards, we have seen a steady demand from the consumer products. The reasons associated with this is pent-up demand, demand for the festival season, and also if I can add that there is what is called as lipstick effect. That was also in play. Like lipstick effect is to indulge into small luxuries to self-gratify, especially in the crisis times and in tough times. So there was some consumption for some of the goods and services towards self-gratification in this period. But if that was the only reason, then probably at some stage we would have seen that demand actually coming down, but that has not happened.
Neil, can I interrupt you for just a second and
Sure.
also ask you that in terms of the future, do you see some of these same trends, like you talked about your the company with that was preserving cash?
Yes.
Are you still seeing? Do you expect to see that kind of risk-averse attitude going forward?
Absolutely, this is a fair question, and we indeed spoke to the company at a later stage, and in fact, company came out with a public statement, and not too long back, about 10 days, 15 days back, and there is a complete change in sentiment, and the same company has announced a capacity expansion, which is almost 1/3 of their existing capacity. This capacity is equivalent to the size of the 4th largest player in the cement industry. So one can imagine like what kind of complete 180-degree change in sentiment which has happened from April to November.
So would it be fair to say that you're finding that irrespective of the slowdown that we saw in some industries in the past, going forward, you expect relatively steady growth and high demand? Is that a fair interpretation?
Actually, one is expecting an acceleration of demand. We will end this current year, FY21, and various expert estimates are in the region of -7 to -8% decline in the economy. And for fiscal 22, the same set of people are expecting a growth rate in the range of 8 to 10%. So one is actually expecting an acceleration in demand, and some of it has already started in the current quarter. And the reasons for that, of course, the deployment of vaccine would be a critical factor in this. But one of the sectors, or a couple of sectors like consumer services, which is still suffering, especially education, entertainment, and hospitality, they are also likely to come back with deployment and mass vaccination program. And second thing,
thank you. Can I move on to Ajay, and I'll get him to talk about this, because his comments go right to your point about what they're expecting, and then we'll come back to you if you don't mind, Neil, too, because this particular issue that you touched upon, I think, is very core to each one of the other panelists, and we would like to hear their views about this. Ajay, can we talk about what your experiences have been? How have you coped as a medium to small enterprise in your industry, and what do you see as the way forward? What are the challenges you've encountered?
Thank you so much, Anju. Thank you, the IIM Calcutta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. I will take you through three things. One is, what is the impact which COVID had on us? What happened? And how are we coping up with that? And then, of course, later we'll go on to the learnings. See, January onwards, we had started seeing a slowdown. So, when COVID came, it hit us like a battering ram. So it's not that things were hunky-dory in the early part of the year and suddenly COVID came. January onwards, slowdown had already started. As a project company, I run a small SME in the water and wastewater treatment business. We are basically a projects company. So projects companies survive on only two things. One is completion of projects, because our money comes only once we complete a project. It normally doesn't come only in advance or delivery of materials. After we have installed and commissioned, it comes. And second is, most project companies survive only on getting fresh orders, advances thereof, supplies thereof, and things like that. So one of the things which happened was that our order book completely dried up. Even, we had a huge sort of pipeline of projects in February, but from March till practically November this year, there were no fresh orders. So what Neelotpal is saying is absolutely right. All capex plans were postponed. All orders which were also under confirmation got postponed. Secondly, due to COVID, all our projects got delayed. From about second week March till about July, we could not work on any project site. We actually worked only on one or two project sites in which we had to send our technicians, which basically means plumbers and electricians, through either flight or through private taxis, even from Chennai to Bangalore. I mean, it added huge costs, but I had to complete projects. There was no public transportation at all, so there was no way they could reach the public, the sites. In one case, one of the leading companies, a subsidiary of a Singapore company, actually terminated our project when it was 99% complete, saying that 2 days work is left and you have exceeded your time. And I got a huge amount locked up there, and it is still under dispute. So, things like that happened to us. I mean, one of the things which we did obviously is that we paid our workmen and the people, at say below 20,000 bucks a month, their full salary even for this period. And we gave only cuts to some of our senior staff, not much. But I think that, to cover this loss, which we have seen for 7-8 months, it may take us practically 2 years. It's not going to happen overnight. But one of the things which we have started seeing now is green shoots. So some of the inquiries which were, in the pipeline of projects in February, March, has suddenly, started reviving. So I booked my first order after 10 months last week. And we are expecting that now from now till about 15 January, 30th January, suddenly this pace will pick up. Post-COVID, we had a completely different set of problems. Many of our experienced staff left us because they said, why do we want to stay in the city where the COVID rates are high? We'll rather live in our villages, where we have our house, we have our farm, we have enough to eat. We just need pocket money. We'll work somewhere around there and get pocket money. So some of my extremely experienced staff, which we have trained for 8, 10 years, left to be in their villages. We always survive on getting working capital, because our working capitals are in a project company completely squeezed. I mean, the largest of project companies have extremely tough working capital cycles, including companies like L&T. So we sometimes take money from private financiers to tide over, temporary working capital glitches. Their rates went through the roof. 2.5% a month went to 6%, 7%, 8% a month, depending on how much he could squeeze you. So, जो हिंदी फिल्म में हम देखते थे, बनिया of the villages has actually come to the towns these days. Most of the corporate sector, some of the largest companies in India started delaying payments. They started using vendors like us to finance their working capital. And there's nothing we could do about it. You work with I'm not going to name, but you work with 4 of the largest companies in India, and their payment cycles went from 45, 60 days to 90 days, 120 days, 150 days. In a project company like ours, the easiest thing to do is to take out an insight. This 500 meters pipeline which you have put is not entirely straight. So just take it out and straighten it again before we release your money. So we got things like that, so ethical and not so unethical, not so ethical means of postponing payments. Another thing which happened with us was that all our vendors started demanding advance payments. Sorry, boss, no credit to you. So as a project company, we got squeezed from both sides. Payments not coming from clients and vendors saying that unless you pay us, we will not, support you. So as Srikant and I discussed one time, apart from somebody, really holding my collar, which happened today, Srikant, in my office. So everything else happened. So the amount of abuse I've heard in the last 3 months, I've not probably heard in the last 36 years. So these are things which happened, and these are things which we have to get over.
How did you cope, Ajay?
Sorry?
What did you do to cope with all these issues?
So what we did was that a few learnings which we had. One is that let's not enter into projects with long timelines, which means no large projects. Concentrate on short projects, 2 months, 3 months, finish the project and get out, get as much advance as possible, which meant not working with large clients. So in fact, I gave up 2 or 3 projects, which were, substantial projects for us because we could not work. I actually went to a customer, he said, we'll blacklist you. I said, blacklist, whitelist, greenlist, doesn't matter. I have to survive. So how many colors you have, please put me on all the colored lists, but I need to survive. So things like that happened. But what we found was that within this entire thing, also there were opportunities. There were opportunities to slightly change our business model. So one of the things which we did was that we realized that there are a lot of companies which will be stressed. So rather than offer a project only on a capex basis, so that they have to spend upfront, we actually tied up with a project finance company to offer projects on a BOO basis, build, own, operate basis, on a 5-year, contract. So I'm happy to say that we signed our first BOO project today. So we think that this will be the future in the next 6 months to 2 years, 3 years, because cash flows, as Neelotpal said, for a lot of companies will be stressed, especially say in the hospitality sector, in the hospital sector, sectors like that, where there were many projects which were half done, 70% done. They will not be able to find capital. So if you can offer a BOO project to them, they'll probably, take it. Second is that, one found that because 6, 7 months, 8 months, most of the plants were closed, whether it is hospitals, whether it is hotels, whether it is industries. So there was a huge scope to do servicing of these plants. So I actually took a few people in my service team so that we can change our business model from a capex to a opex, on an operations basis. So we started taking operation and maintenance contracts. We started doing AMCs. We started doing service. So what was 5 to 7% of our turnover is now in excess of 20% of our turnover. So these were some of the things we did. And also one of the major things we did was we started talking to our vendors. We said, look, you and I are in the same problem. It's not that we are in different problems. We are in the same sea. The sharks are the same. The fish are the same. So let us work out an arrangement whereby instead of giving you 100% advance, whatever I owe you from before, I will give you that. You keep on supplying me 90% of that value so that your outstanding to me goes down, but I am able to complete my projects. Because if my project business stops and if my company stops, you are not going to get anything. Some people agreed, some didn't. So we are now working with vendors who agreed. We have started, dispatching items now, dispatching our plants. And hopefully in another 2 months from now, we should be back to about 80 to 90% of our peak levels. So these are the 3-4 learnings which we had, and that's how we dealt with it.
Thank you so much, Ajay. I'm going to come back to you in a bit if we have time to ask you which of these strategic moves that you made will be sustained, that these turned out to be long-run opportunities, not just a short-run reaction. But let me go to Srikant first, next, and ask him to comment about what you've seen, Srikant, in the last few months. What challenges have you encountered? in the entrepreneurial world that you deal with,
Sure.
and what do you see going forward?
Sure. But I must first congratulate Ajay and also request you to host these events more often, because
I know
clearly
that.
today is an auspicious day for Ajay. Hopefully he'll get more business if he hosts more such events. Uh,
Absolutely.
Lighter on that was on a lighter note, but here's what I do. Typically, just as Neil goes around asking for information, this is one of my curiosity points also. Every time I meet a startup, or preferably a large group of startups, which is what I get to meet at incubators, I run a lot of training programs also. I run a poll to ask them what was their experience during COVID and post COVID. I typically get these days what I call as the 20-40-40 split. 20% of them say, look, we've suffered irreparable damage, we've not recovered. 40% of them say there was a temporary setback, but we're on the path to recovery. And another 40%, interestingly, say, we discovered new opportunities, new ways of working. It's put us on a trajectory that we could not have imagined in the past. So that's the broad split that we see. And I'm seeing this pattern repeat itself with various audiences, doesn't matter which part of the country. I've also run programs for mid-sized companies and large companies. I'm seeing the same thing actually. So what is it that makes that 40% of them, which move to a new trajectory, what makes them different? That was the next thing I was curious about. So one reason clearly is that some of them had natural advantages. If you are in a space which is ed tech, that is booming because online education is booming. Likewise, digital health. If you were making COVID related products and services, there was a large consumption, immediate orders in cash, that was great. Essential products and services. I'm on the board of a company that it provides last mile delivery to the local grocer near our house. They were treated as essential service. Their business went up. Online entertainment and gaming, online retail, and some tech sectors which are basically focused on either cloud or digital, they also saw a boom. So leaving aside those natural advantages that some startups or fast growing companies had, there's one other important reason. And I'm going to quote the exact words of another incubator head where I'm on the board of. And I was asking him the same question, what's happened? He said, look, two things. One, within the same incubator, if there are 100 startups, the ones who did well are the ones who displayed agility. And he gave me an example. They had two startups, both in the biotech or medtech space. Both of them had the same opportunity. One of them moved much faster, much more aggressively. They were the first Indian company to create the RT-PCR kits that were used for COVID testing. And they moved from base zero. They were not in they were in a related business. They moved very quickly into that business, replaced all imports, and suddenly shot up. And now they're exporting and they're producing a massive volume. So agility was the key differentiator between. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? What were the drivers of this agility, Srikant?
So one is, and I'm going to again quote this friend of mine who's at that incubator, which shall remain unnamed. He said, COVID separated the men from the boys. At incubators, a lot of startups get used to working on the early stage grants that you get from various government schemes or otherwise. They get very comfortable. The ones who work best when there's a fire under them, they are the ones who are kind of stand apart, and that's what happened here. That's the key difference. And to me, that's the difference between incubators as well. IIMCIP did well during this period because the leadership was proactive. I've seen other incubators which actually said in March, hey, lockdown declared, next 3 months, we need not do anything. And the pandemic just went on and on and on. So there's some others like IIMCIP who just said, we got to do it, whatever be the problem. So I think it's an attitude. This agility comes from a positive attitude saying, whatever be the adversity, we're going to overcome it. People pivoted. And you would imagine that travel industry is the worst hit, right? Everyone's got killed in that business. But one of the IIMCIP startups, he used to be offering travel related services in the Northeast. He said, since that's not happening now, let me at least start thinking about how can I offer safe travel going forward. Caravan travel, for example, is safe because people want to go in a group of 4 people that they know. There's another one which was in the business of auto repair. They pivoted to cleaning of cars, cleaning of office, sanitizing offices. They cleaned the home of the governor of Assam, for example. So it's a mindset. Can I move into an adjacent business where I have natural strengths, and can I tap into that opportunity? That's what drives agility, actually.
Thank you so much, Srikant. So there is a company that's very agile, Venki. On to you. What have been your experiences? And your industry has also changed, but in a different manner, perhaps, than the others that we've talked about so far. Tell us. Share you.
Sure. So I think our industry on the whole, the IT services part of it is one thing. The digital part of it has really grown, right? Like, when you really look at it, the broader, the investments that have gone into digital all these years have just been vindicated, right? Like COVID has been one of those moments. If you look at like the bigger players, the FANG in the US, like, their stock prices have grown from 14% to 70%, 77%, like year to date, right? Like in the midst of the worst recession possible. And Reliance Jio raised like, $15 billion in 10 weeks. That's more than like, the total, FDI inflow into India from the time I was born to the time my daughter was born, a 30-year period, right? Like, so it just shows that like, there's smart money that's chasing growth here. It also shows a little bit of consolidation here. So, and I think e-commerce, right? What Amazon reached in terms of e-commerce growth for a 10-year period, they just saw a sharp inflection because of COVID. In an 8-week period, just like went up so significantly. So the gist is like, I think this has been a great moment for digital, right? Like that's definitely what we see. I share some use cases and some negatives that like I see happening around this, right? So some of the use cases are from the media, some are personal experiences. COVID has kind of like shown how real the utility of like digital and social media is in our lives. Starting from that Wuhan doctor who kind of discussed in the WeChat group about like this funny looking disease, like which has not been named as that, like having these patterns, right? The way in which information spread, logistics and coordination happened, right? And business continuity was done. I think like digital, is going to attract a lot of investment just on account of that. So government response, we were involved. A few of us from my batch, along with a few people from the 55th batch, the batch of 2020, which passed out in something called Defeat COVID. We were working closely with Vinny Mahajan of the government of Punjab, and we were help them use digital technologies to kind of cope with COVID, right? And the government of Telangana also. And these are use cases like using Captain Amrinder Singh's handle to kind of like get out information, because there was so much.
Say that again. I'm sorry. How did you help? What was the project again, Venki?
So this was a not-for-profit, a pro bono exercise, like, a group of like 29 batches and a group of 55th batches came together. And we were given, one of our biggest customers, like it's pro bono, it's not-for-profit, was Vinny Mahajan of 22nd batch, who is currently the Chief Secretary of Government of Punjab. Yeah. And she put us onto that Directorate of Governance Reforms, and we worked with them. And it's all about like, hey, like, there is this huge demand coming up for multiple things. How can we use digital technologies to kind of cope with it? So there's communication challenges. There was things like, case tracking, right? Like, patient tracking. Doctors going into COVID wards were not able to carry people because if you get infected, it's just a matter of digitizing it and stuff like that. So we put it together all like, voluntary, right? Like, so that was a great experience, right? So, and like the government is like thinking in terms of e-governance, right? Like, once the pandemic kind of like, slows down, when people come out, they don't want people rushing into government offices for government services. So e-governance is being this topic, and they're using this crisis to see if they can drive e-governance to what they call M-governance and M-Seva, right? Like, so people don't have to come into a government office to get a birth certificate or whatever. So we help them with all those things, right? With the IIMC network. Another thing, like, so this is from a government perspective. Another thing from an NGO perspective was in Chennai, a bunch of us were involved in something called Feed by Chennai. Ramraj, like, who was in the Board of Governors, like, drove it, actually. And it was originally initiated in Bangalore by Ganesh, again of 19th batch. And we used social media significantly to drive awareness. We fed around 1 million memes during 8 weeks, during the early phase of lockdown, when people were kind of like stuck in Chennai. Million is just in Chennai, thereby like it was a much bigger number, right? Like so, the entire fundraising and like like awareness and all that happened like all over social media and digital technologies, right? So that was like it was just unimaginable coordinating like such complex efforts, right? Together. And I know like IIMC is doing a case study on that, so like it's a matter of pride for all of us. So.
Well done. It's an amazing story. Thank you for sharing and really well done.
Thank you. And like we see this like all the way going through like e-commerce. Like I was talking to someone in the C-suite of Amazon, and again another batchmate from Joka, and he's talking about like how e-commerce and Kirana have both benefited, but modern trade have suffered, and like the agility that comes in like through data and like the ability to redirect like resources was critical in like achieving that, right? And finally, enterprise collaboration, right? So you found Microsoft Teams and Slack and Zoom really like go up in adoption. Teams grew 6-fold in usage in terms of number of minutes of meeting in a 20-day period, right? And in terms of number of users, they kind of like jumped some 4-fold or whatever in a 1 year period. These are 5 or 7 or 8 years of like growth compressed into like 2 or 3 months. So we're going to see some permanent structural behavioral changes as a result of it. There are also some negatives that we've
What
seen,
is
right?
that? What is the permanent? What is something that you see? A couple of really important permanent structural changes.
So we've seen this disaggregation of like work streams across the globe, right? Mm-hmm. And like there are of course geopolitical trends which kind of like insist on resiliency. But I think like the pandemic has like essentially like thrown that open. So like for the entire IT services industry, all our employees are working from their homes, right? Like and like not in Chennai.
Is that
right?
good?
I'm sorry?
Is that good?
That is good and bad to it. Like I think like we need to like definitely get them back together to create the rapport and maintain the rapport for sure. But we see big opportunities. That's what that's we are a micro MNC. Right? We've done business with companies in Israel, even in Syria, like before the war and all that, right? Sitting out of like Chennai, right? We've never visited these geographies. People find us. We find ways of getting them to trust us, and we are able to do this entire thing like like remotely. So if you're able to do that with a customer, why not with our employees also? That kind of like gives us access to a bigger pool of talent, and like it helps like our employees like handle their work-life balance better. So there are good things about it for sure. There is going to be a loss of rapport. So we have to find some ways of like patching it. So I would say there are other negatives, right? Like depression and anxiety, we see that like like significantly, right? I think and I don't know if you've seeing this like new documentary called The Social Dilemma about how the algorithm and the feed controls us, right? Like about how it chooses to feed us and keep us hooked onto the platform. We've seen a lot of that for sure. And the concentration of power, right? Like all this growth in these big companies means that like that like concentration is like so significant in social media, it's just unbreakable. So that I will stop there like for the first round about like the impact that we've seen in digital and social.
Well, thank you so much. I would like to ask the panelists, are there questions that you have for each other? Because I could see you with your thinking caps on when some of you were speaking. So let me step back a minute and ask you to chat.
I'd like to ask Neil, he forecasted 8 to 10% growth next year. Neil, you said that, right? And I'm just trying to figure out whether it's going to be back on all these new sectors which will ride the wave of digital and technology, or you think even the traditional sectors will come back to a fair degree of normalcy?
Thank you for this question. First of all, these are the consensus estimate of the experts in this industry. But I will not focus too much on the fiscal 22 number because a lot of that is on the back of the negative number that we have got this year. I would like to focus on F23 number, and that is crucial because that is what the trend growth would be. Now, is that going to be 6 to 7%? Or is that going to be 5%? Are going to remain stuck in 5%? Now that is crucial. And for that, my belief is that the success of the recent reform measures which has been undertaken by the government, that is going to be the differentiator. If one is able to succeed in some of these 3-4 set of reform measures has been taken, then probably we can move into the 6-7% trajectory. Else, we will remain stuck in the 5% zone as a trend growth rate. Specifically, I would like to mention one or two reform measures, and that is the production-linked incentive scheme for promoting manufacturing. Now, these could usually probably would be in the smaller size companies itself. The first phase of that has been well received by the electronics manufacturing and in the pharmaceutical. So these are to some extent newer industries, newer companies and CapEx to answer your question. And now it is going to be extended to 10 more sectors, the details of which will come in the forthcoming weeks and days. And then we'll see. But if the same level of adoption is going to be there, then that augurs well. One more point actually with respect to the newer CapEx where it can come in, and that is from the geopolitical perspective, that there is likelihood of acceleration in the supply chain shift. Now this trend started in 2018 after US-China trade war, and then it went into a lull or so in the second half of 2019. But because of this pandemic, when people realized that if the supply chain is China-centric, and then it has led to the disruption in the global supply chain. So there is a wider adoption of having a China plus one strategy in the diversification of the supply chain. And that's where the newer investments can come into the country and could drive the additional growth. So these are the two areas I'd like to point out.
So this is the Make in India initiative that we are looking at.
Yes and no, actually. It is the base may be the Make in India, but now it's called Atmanirbhar Bharat.
Yeah, Atmanirbhar, right. Yes, absolutely. So good. So so Ajay, but moving on, you're building on this point of the growth that you see, you're starting off, you talked about green shoots. Do you see acceleration? Do you see pent-up demand that is going to take off? Or are you still seeing cautiousness? And how do you cope with that?
Well, certainly, I am seeing a lot of cautiousness. I think there is a pent-up demand. There is no denying that. But people are not going headlong and saying that 6 months, 8 months we have not done capex. Let's do it next month. It's not happening like that. A lot of people are very cautious. A lot of people are very cost conscious. So they are saying pre-COVID rates we need 5%, 10%, 20% below that rate. Whereas, with steel prices up, all vendors, and we have no choice. Companies like Kirloskar, Grundfos and all have raised prices by 10 to 15% in the last 8 months. So my view is that we will see certainly a growth, but I am not very sure whether we'll see a V shape or a U shape or a hockey stick growth. I don't think it's going to happen. It's going to be slow. It's going to be laborious. And, we have to just go through the next 3 to 6 months or maybe 9 months, persevering with what we have. And, as we go along, trying to book new orders, trying to take new projects, I think the real demand may come a year later from today, after people have seen the COVID effects go or the vaccine succeed and, the feel good factor, so as to say, comes back. Only after that, at least in the capex, I think the real demand will come after the feel-good factor comes back. That's what I feel.
Thank you. So do you see it is only a temporary change to more service-oriented activities? You were talking about the shift to from 8% to 20% of your revenue stream now comes from services rather than from projects. Do you see that returning, or do you see that as a permanent shift and just growth in both?
No, I see, at least for us, that as a permanent shift, because we have realized that service is something, which is continuous, it is repetitive, it is an annuity business, so probably it's a good business to be in. Margins may be lower, but it's a good business, more stable business. Capex is dependent on a whole lot of other things. Here, if you sign a 5-year operation and maintenance contract, at least for the next 60 months, you are assured of a certain revenue, which you are never sure of in the capex projects. So I see this shift as a near permanent shift. But I think let's see as we go along what happens.
Thank you. Venki, do you see some semi-permanent shifts in strategic behavior in strategies in your businesses?
Sure. So the work from home is like a big shift. Like we saw.
You think that's pretty permanent?
That's I think it's going to significantly increase as a percentage, right? I think you had like this entire freelancer moment happening, and I think that's continuing to happen. There is a creative industry that's kind of like significantly individually oriented. A lot of work from home. So technology has enabled it. Behavior has changed more than anything else. I think technology has never been the constraint, right? Like, the behavior has changed. And it's been forced to be changed by this. So we definitely see that as a and increased digitization for sure. The business continuity has been put to a new test, right? Like previously, it was about non-availability of one or two sites. Suddenly, it's non-availability. The lockdown has kind of redefined business continuity. So the need for digital, right? Like be it customer-facing digital or internally facing digital, right? Like, which is digitization process and all that, is for sure going to increase a lot.
What about the demand for infrastructure, that digital infrastructure that then is necessary for digitization of the type that you're talking about?
Sure. So I think that has been the big thing there is cloud, right? Like cloud and I was talking to this this Amazon executive, and AWS is going through the roof in terms of and the same thing with Microsoft and other cloud vendors, right? I just shudder to imagine what we would have done to cope with this pandemic had it happened 8 to 10 years back when we didn't have this infrastructure, right? It was a very different thing. We still would have had this pandemic spread out because it's still a globalized world in terms of air traffic. This would have spread the way it spread this time. But in terms of our ability to cope, it would have been a lot more limited. The way we managed to get information out and the way we managed to kind of get people back working from remote locations. So cloud has been one big part of it. And I think again, I think a lot of those bets, the early bets in terms of the amount of investment that went in, has completely been validated through these 6 months.
Excellent. Srikant, what about you? Do you see some semi-permanent shifts in the way incubators, entrepreneurship operates?
Yeah, I would think so, because I think picking up from what Venki said, work from home related to that is the need for travel will go down dramatically. I'm hearing that from CEOs of global companies. I'm hearing that from startups, that a lot of work now just gets done remotely. People don't insist, particularly in India, where people love to sit across the table and have a conversation. That's no longer going to be insisted. And that is going to increase productivity, because you're not going to spend time on planes or at airports for delayed flights. You're going to spend time doing the work that is needed to be done. So that's one important element. The other is, Neil spoke about policy-related initiatives from government, which will help us in the future. But I'm seeing a more fundamental behavioral or attitude change. You know that I led a project for creating a ICU ventilator from scratch in under 90 days, where we had a task force of 20 people. But the biggest change we saw there was the government, the science and technology institutions of India, and incubators working in a completely different way. They were soporific all these years, but suddenly they've all woken up to a new reality. And I think those fundamental attitudinal changes are also going to stand us in good stead. I'm just going to stop by giving you one example. This was on the 9th of April. India was in a lockdown. We desperately needed some components to make the ventilator. 60% of the components are imported. It was stuck in the Singapore warehouse of the supplier. Singapore was in a lockdown. No flights, no courier services. The Indian government swung into action. The Ministry of External Affairs spoke to the High Commission in Singapore, Indian High Commission. They figured out that there's an empty Singapore Airlines flight coming to India to take back stranded Singaporeans. They figured out a way to put that consignment on that empty flight, sent it to us. And by the way, the Singapore High Commission paid that money in advance on our behalf. Now that, you might say this is a special case during pandemic, but I think that at least a part of this is going to be a permanent change. All of this clearly is going to make a huge difference going forward. There's a realization from everyone that there is an emergency. It's not going to go away. We need to do something dramatically different. So all of this is going to play out well, actually.
I think all of the things that you've talked about are so central to the theme of IIMCreate, the IIM Calcutta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. All of these fundamental shifts that you're talking about are shifts in innovation, or the capability to innovate in one fashion or another. And also very central to the Atmanirbhar initiative. So that's wonderful to hear going forward. Neil, I'm going to ask you to give us a few closing thoughts on the question of innovation overall in the Indian economy and Atmanirbhar, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. Yeah, so this is an integral part, and we have seen and examples given as well, that the companies which have been more agile or quicker in the digital adoption, they have done better. So from the perspective of the users also, we have seen like in the retailing industry and in the e-commerce industry, those who have innovated, they have been able to grow faster and gain market share from the competition. There were obvious losses in terms of some of the channels in the consumer delivery, consumer product delivery, because they were forced to shut down. But the companies has to innovate to actually gain that market share. The second point being that even if the options are available to each, for instance, and Srikant covered that in his opening comment, that why some companies did benefit. And there again, for instance, let's take this farm laws, the new amendment which has happened. And it's already has been passed. So the companies which will benefit from here are those which are into the storage and transportation of the farm produce. There are some companies which have already been planning and going ahead and moving faster than sitting lagging behind. And then obviously, when that becomes the norm, they would be the gainers here, which is what we see. And the digital thing is adoption is one of the key enablers, which has enabling the companies to innovate and gain market share, because overall pie is not growing and not growing at a faster pace than what we desire, and which is why gaining of market share is important, and that's what we are focusing on.
Thank you so much.
So if there are no other comments from the esteemed panelists, then I would request Professor Aditi Botoria, faculty at Public Policy and Management and member of CEI, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. I'm at a loss of words. I've had a most wonderful last 1 hour listening to all the panelists and the questions. And on behalf of the IIM Calcutta Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, the IIM Calcutta Innovation Cell and Entrepreneurship Cell, the attendees here and the students, I would like to extend a hearty vote of thanks to this esteemed group of panelists. I would start with thanking Mr. Neelotpal Sahai, Mr. Venkatesh Krishnamoorthi, of course, Srikant Sastri, always such a pleasure listening to your views, and definitely Mr. Ajay Jain. Mr. Jain, your contribution, not just as a co-panelist, but also helping us organize this event, is truly appreciated. Thank you so much. Most definitely our very own Institute Director, Professor Anju Seth, for guiding us at CEI and also for steering the conversation to bring out the best out of this conversation. Thank you so much. Finally, obviously, Professor Balram Avitur. I mean, one of the most nicest people to work with, really, and leading and coordinating the CEI activities. Shubhrangshu is working with us. And last but definitely not the least, the students who've been a very important part of this organization. Nikhil, thank you so much. Pramit, I am, who's organizing the IT. I can see Navya, Jaideep, thank you so much for all contributing towards this effort. And I was just taking a word cloud of all the things that we were talking about, and the diversity is surely interesting. I mean, we spoke about markets, startups, e-commerce, e-governance, telecommunications, telemedicine. We were talking about different countries. We were talking about long-term, short-term, medium-term, permanent changes because of COVID-19, AI, ML, so all of that. And that basically surely tells us how much can be achieved in an hour and has set up standards for productive conversation. And we've all gone through unprecedented times with COVID-19, but I think the one thing that we take away with us is motivation, motivation through discourse, through communication, and connecting with like-minded individuals. And this was exactly that. I am sure that the audience today was absolutely inspired by your wise words. So on that note, thank you once again, and wish you all a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year in advance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Aditi.
Aditi.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy New Year. Merry Christmas. Thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining
Bye.
us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.